Welcome to Foundations in the Mathematics of Finance. We're going to discuss in this lesson a brief history of interest. First thing we're going to do is understand what interest is, and then we're going to take a look at it over time. So before we can understand any concepts relating to time value of money, we need to understand the concept of interest, which is receiving money as rent for money that is loaned to somebody else. The payment of interest recognizes that the use of this money or capital has measurable value and that value is impacted by time. Now, if you go back in history, there's mention of interest all the way back in the time of the Babylonians. So it dates back at least several thousand years. Babylonian debts were typically charged 20% interest, and this amount and percentage was often mentioned in the contract tablets that were used to conclude business deals. Going before that time, in ancient Israel, the ancient Jews were also well acquainted with the concept of interest, and references to interest can be found in many books of the Jewish law. The Jews were forbidden to charge interest amongst themselves. However, it was okay to charge the Gentiles interest because the Gentiles would charge the Jews interest, and so all is fair in both directions there. Now, that these books of the Bible, including the books of Moses, mention interest, suggests that it has far earlier roots, definitely back as early as ancient Egypt, and possibly even earlier. And there's references in very, very ancient texts regarding charging interest on commodity loans, not just on loans of money. So if I borrowed a bushel of wheat from you, or if I borrowed 5 bales of hay, that I would have to pay some interest on that. So the idea of interest, charging for the use of capital, charging for the use of a valuable resource as it is lent from one person to another over time, is a very, very old practice. Now, during the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church forbade interest, since in their opinion, time is something that belongs to God. And since you're charging for time, when you charge interest, you are therefore charging for something that belongs to God, which isn't right. However, economic expansion and booming trade during the Renaissance period brought the concept of interest back into favor, and eventually was embraced by the church. The shift that allowed people to get their heads around this was that in those times, money was being borrowed for use in production as well as consumption. Now, early loans were often for consumption purposes. You had a bad harvest, and therefore you borrowed some grain from someone else to plant your field and to feed your family. However, during the Renaissance, people were borrowing in order to make investments and to fund business propositions. So if the borrower would profit from the use of the money, why shouldn't the lender profit as well? Additionally, there was recognition that there was a risk involved in lending money, the risk of no repayment, and so interest could be seen as a risk premium as well. Now, as we go through time, moving towards the present, there's growing acceptance that the lender experienced an opportunity cost when they loaned money to someone else. They could not use that money themselves while it was in someone else's possession, and therefore they deserve some type of compensation. And also supply and demand would influence the cost of money. If money was in great supply and demand was low, interest would be low. And as we get into the 19th century, we have our first formal studies of interest, and the emerging science of economics really deepened our understanding. In the 20th century, we make a distinction between nominal and real rates of interest. And finally, even today, the Islamic world generally agrees that the Quran forbids the practice of charging interest. However, there is no prohibition against making gains through trade or commerce. Therefore, Islamic banking systems tend to use trade-based interest surrogates instead of interest. And that's our brief introduction to interest. Please feel free to study this topic more.